everyone, and welcome to video 1 of our Cooking and Cooling Alternative Support for Appendix A and B video series. This video is brought to you by AAMP's Outreach. I am Abbey Davidson, and I'll be walking you through the requirements of Appendix A and B and alternate support for certain products. I would like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Jonathan Campbell and Dr. Jeff Sindelar for their knowledge and aiding to put these presentations together. As I walk you through this presentation, if you have any questions, please make sure to write it down, and you can contact myself at abby@aamp.com or Nelson Gatos, my outreach counterpart, at nelson@aamp.com. So the reason behind this mini video series is to aid processors in identifying and helping identify alternate support for their processes if it's needed, other than the 2021 Appendix A and B. We will walk through the requirements of Appendix A and B as it pertains to large diameter products, including roasts and bone and ham production. We will also discuss alternate support options if the critical limits in Appendix A and B are not possible for your facility to maintain. There are many hurdles that need addressed when processing larger diameter products, such as bone and hams. With the 2021 update of Appendix A and B, there are concerns that the processors may not be able to meet the critical limits outlined in the support. This includes meeting the Appendix A required come-up time window, meeting the relative humidity requirements, ensuring the appropriate time and temperature combos are met, and that the products cool in an amount of time that yields favorable food safety results. As we move forward through this presentation, when I reference Appendix A or Appendix B, please note that I am referencing the 2021 versions of each. If using Appendix A critical limits for cooking, products must reach these critical limits that are outlined here on this slide, which are the time and temperature combinations, the come-up time criteria, as well as the relative humidity requirements outlined in the compliance guideline. We will also discuss the scientific gaps identified in Appendix A and B related to large diameter products later in this presentation. So the pathogens listed here are the major pathogens of concern as we cook meat and poultry products. Staphylococcus aureus is the pathogen of concern during come-up time and heating, which is prior to lethality. Salmonella, no matter the species of product cooked, can be used as the indicator organism for lethality, or also called the target organism. This is because if Salmonella is destroyed via thermal destruction, most other pathogens should be as well. So these are the important biological hazards to keep in mind when building your hazard analysis. Note, this is not fully complete, and you do need to make sure you complete your full hazard analysis when you're building your plan. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the 3 critical parameters that are outlined in Appendix A. So the critical parameter 1 is making sure that products meet the time and temp combinations that you see on a screen. There is another part to this that we'll look at in the next slide, but these are the time and temp combos that we really need to shoot for if you're going to meet these requirements. So we do recommend that processors meet the 7 log 10 lethality time that's over on the far right if you are going to use this time temp table. The time temp combos listed here are specific to option 1 and 2 of the humidity requirements that we will discuss here shortly if the endpoint temperature is greater than 145 degrees. Again, note this is specific to options 1 and 2 of the humidity requirements we will discuss shortly. For come-up time, these are the requirements that have to be met if using the critical parameters in Appendix A. The total time product temperature is between 50 degrees and 130 degrees, needs to be 6 hours or less. This is the internal product temperature for enhanced, injected whole muscle, or non-whole muscle products. Note that FSIS will allow the use of scientific gaps for now, which again, we will also discuss later on in this presentation. Note you can also utilize alternate support, including pathogen modeling predictions, to support your process. As for humidity, this is critical parameter number 3. In the chart displayed here, a facility has 4 options for humidity requirements to choose from. So note earlier when talking about the time and temperature combinations, anything greater than 145, you could use the time and temp combos for these specific 2 options for humidity, option 1 and 2. So option 1, if you're cooking product for longer than 1 hour and the endpoint temperature is greater than 145 degrees plus dwell time, the relative humidity of the oven needs to be maintained by continuously introducing steam for 50% of the cooking time, or 1 hour, whichever is longer. Option 2 is when you cook product longer than 1 hour at a temperature of 145 degrees or greater plus the dwell time, and the relative humidity of the oven is needed to be maintained by a sealed oven for at least 50% of the total cooking time, or 1 hour, whichever is longer. Option 3 and option 4 are also available to you, and I definitely recommend pausing here if you'd like to read them. Just note they're less common, I would say, than option 1 and 2. So on page 31 of the compliance guideline, this note is pulled right out of there. So note that you do not need to track humidity for products that weigh 10 pounds or more in an oven maintained at 250 degrees or higher. The interesting thing to keep in mind here is your products will always have to be greater than 10 pounds, and there can't be any discrepancy on that for this requirement to not be needed. Okay, so moving on, this is the scientific gap that is specific to large diameter products like hams and beef brisket. Roasts fall into the scientific gap as well. So to use this gap, processors will need to use any of the applicable endpoint time and temperature combinations that were on the time temp combo slides previously, as well as meeting one of the relative humidity critical parameters discussed previously. The caveat here is that come-up time would not be used as a critical limit if you are using the scientific gap. It's suggested that a facility further limit their vulnerabilities by utilizing additional scientific support for a slow come-up time, reducing the product diameter when feasible, complete a pathogen modeling profile for specific products processes, and or applying smoke to product to further reduce microbial load potential on the product. There's also the option of performing a challenge study for this specific plant's process or conducting finished product verification testing. So if your facility cannot meet the scientific gap we just discussed or cannot meet any of the critical limits prescribed in Appendix A, there are other options. One option is the use of scientific studies. Another is the use of predictive microbial monitoring. And yet another is the use of challenge studies. Note the first 2 listed here are the cheaper, less time-intensive options. Challenge studies certainly could take a lot of time and capital. This is one of the first scientific documents that would be a good alternate large diameter support, but please make sure you review this note down here. So this is specific for beef round roasts and hams. And they have tables within the study that have different relative humidities and lethality temps to shoot for. The big thing to keep in mind here is that this scientific support has an extra document attached to it, and that extra document identifies that the above reference support does not in itself prove that performance standards and targets are met. So additional support will be needed to prove safety, and a computer model with this support will be sufficient. So a pathogen modeling model would be sufficient to support this paper. For the scientific study on this screen, this is also a great article to support longer come-up times for cured bacon and cured ham. I know we're talking specifically about bone-in hams here at this time, so you definitely want to take a look at the 3rd bullet down, the up to 24 hours come-up and cook time for ham. But please know, if you're going to use this study, this is not a study that supports lethality. So processors will still have to use Appendix A time and temp combos or utilize alternate support to support their process for lethality. This scientific document here is just supporting come-up time. So furthermore, this study, the evaluation of Staphylococcus aureus growth potential in ham during the slow cooking process, use of predictions derived from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Pathogen Modeling Program 6.1, Predictive Model and Inoculation Study, is also a good support document. This is good support for staph growth, but if you identify other pathogens as hazards in your process, additional support will be needed to prove these pathogens are not likely to occur. Additionally, lactate will typically need to be in the recipe for these products if this study is used. For this document, the contribution of humidity to the lethality of surface-attached heat-resistant salmonella during the thermal processing of cooked, ready-to-eat roast beef. This is a valuable document if you produce fully cooked, ready-to-eat beef. This article identifies adequate relative humidity if the relative humidity is 30% for the whole cooking time at 145 degrees internal temperature or greater. Remember, if the products you're cooking are greater than 10 pounds, relative humidity does not need to be tracked per the Appendix A guidance. But if you're going to be using this roast beef support, relative humidity would need to be tracked. These are just simple reminders with the new appendices. So the first reminder here is making sure that you map for cold spots in your smokehouse. And if you need help with doing that, definitely reach out to us, please. This information must be kept on site as part of your validation. Additionally, if you use temperature monitoring equipment with a calibration range, your operational limit must be on the high side of that calibration range. So the example is if your CCP temperature is 158 degrees and the equipment you are monitoring the temperature with has a calibration range of plus or minus 2 degrees, your operational limit needs to be greater than or equal to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so that was a quick overview in the Appendix A requirements, as well as the alternate limits and alternate support for Appendix A. We're going to move on to Appendix B and cooling. Processors are concerned that the cooling limits may be too stringent and that they may struggle meeting the critical limits that are outlined in Appendix B. The two pathogens of concern, the biological hazards during cooling, are Clostridium perfringens and Clostridium botulinum. Vegetative cells are killed during lethality. However, Clostridium perfringens spores are not and can actually germinate and then grow during cooling. And they can grow to dangerous levels if not properly managed and controlled. Other pathogenic cells are destroyed during the heat treatment, leaving little competition for the clostridial species. Limited or no oxygen present, as well as danger zone temperatures, can cause clostridial growth to occur. Products should be processed to allow no growth of Clostridium botulinum and less than 1 log growth of Clostridium perfringens per the compliance guideline we discussed. So the first thing to think about when cooling product are the factors that affect cooling. If a processor has issues cooling their product, the processor should look at the size, shape, and weight of the product and stacking or storage in the cooler, air velocity or initial temperature of the cooler freezer, as well as product composition. It may be time for some new product development or a cooler and a freezer revamp at this time. So further, here's a list of product characteristics that also affect food safety during cooling. These include your product time and temperature profile, the pH of the product, the percent of brine concentration in the product, the type and concentration of phosphates on a weight-to-weight basis, water activity, type and concentration of organic acid salts, ingoing sodium nitrite and erythorbate or ascorbate concentrations. So in Appendix B, this is Table 1, which is used for products that are cooked to and reach a full lethality temperature. Any of these options are available for products that are cooked to full lethality. And specifically, these are cooling parameters for products that have hit a full lethality temperature. I would pause here and take a look and identify what options will work best for each HACCP plan within your facility. Table 2 is for products that are not cooked to full lethality. Again, either of these options will work for products that are not cooked to full lethality, but I would also pause this slide and make sure that you can meet one of the options before you move forward. So those were the cooling guidelines identified in the Appendix B compliance guideline. Now we're going to move on to the scientific gap 1 in Appendix B. Please take into consideration the vulnerabilities and alternatives when adding this gap as a CCP. Note that the scientific gap 1 is for products that are large diameter that can't cool quickly enough to meet the options in Table 1. This is for fully cooked products. The critical operating parameters from older guidance for this scientific gap is that product will begin chilling within 90 minutes after the cooking cycle is complete, that cooling occurs from 120 to 55 degrees in less than 6 hours, and the product continuously chills until it reaches 40 degrees. For scientific gap 2, again, take a look at the vulnerabilities on the far right column and identify if within your operation you can reduce those vulnerabilities. Scientific gap 2 is specifically to partially heat-treated smoked products that contain nitrite and erythorbate or ascorbate and have long come up and cooling times. The critical operating parameters from older guidance are in column 3. So you would apply option 1.3 to this partially heat-treated product, and that would be specifically cooling from 130 degrees to 80 degrees in 5 hours or less, and 80 degrees to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in 10 hours or less, with a 15-hour total cooling time. Note with the scientific gap 2, there is no come-up time parameter. Scientific gap 3 was not specific to roast or bone and ham production, so we skipped that one for this presentation. Scientific gap 4 is specific to immersion or dried cured products that contain nitrite and or nitrate and or nitrite, and use of equilibration time instead of erythorbate or ascorbate, but you cannot meet the cooling options without nitrite in Table 1 or Table 2. So there's a lot to that. Just remember that you do want to, again, look at the vulnerabilities in the far right column here and do what you can to reduce those vulnerabilities. So to utilize scientific gap 5, again, make sure you're meeting the requirements and doing what you can to reduce the vulnerabilities in this far right side. This scientific gap is for products that contain nitrite and use equilibration time instead of erythorbate or ascorbate, but you do not have a brine concentration of greater than or equal to 6% to be able to meet the option 1.4 cooling. Okay, so if your facility cannot meet the scientific gap we just discussed, or cannot meet any of the critical limits identified in Appendix B, these are the other options. One option is the use of scientific studies, one is the use of predictive microbial monitoring, and one is the use of challenge studies. Note the first two listed here are the cheaper, less time-intensive options. Okay, so this is one of the documents for alternate cooling in cooked hams. The title here is The Influence of Sodium Chloride Content and Cooling Rate on Outgrowth of Clostridium perfringens Spores in Cooked Ham and Beef. This is written by Laura Elzaica, and this allows for up to 21 hours of cooling for hams. Note to use this study, your hams will have to have greater than 2% salt concentration. And note that this document here is not adequate support for roast beef cooling support on its own. This support is specific to cooked ham products. Here is another study, which is the Osterbauer et al. Study from 2017. And the cooling parameters listed here are cooling products from 130 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit in 10 hours and 15 hours cooling from 80 degrees to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Note you do have to meet the validated options of the concentrations of nitrite and erythorbate listed here on the screen to use this study. If the listener needs help with conducting pathogen modeling results, they certainly can reach out to myself or Nelson. As shown in the slide, the models for Clostridium perfringens for cooked, uncured beef, pork, and chicken can be used from ARS's pathogen modeling program. And the models for Clostridium perfringens in cooked cured beef and pork, as well as Clostridium perfringens in cooked beef supplemented with salt, sodium nitrite, and sodium pyrophosphate are validated through this pathogen modeling program as well. Here is a list of other published processing guidelines for cooling if you would like to shoot and meet for one of these instead of the critical limits we've already discussed previously. If processors have issues with cooling their products, listed on this slide are good examples of ways to ensure cooling product occurs in a quick way. Note that increasing airflow and leaving more space between products and walls are the most impactful ways to make sure that cooling is completed quickly. Conducting research on your own, we have some suggestions. You definitely want to utilize the scientific terms when searching. So instead of cooking, use the term lethality. Instead of cooling, use the term stabilization. Meat can also be called protein when searching. We definitely suggest utilizing specific keywords, so water activity or pH. Reducing your search to one search engine is not suggested. We definitely want to make sure that you do not limit your search to just one search engine. And we want to make sure that you can meet all the parameters in the study that you want to use. Finally, listed here are some sources for researching. And as stated throughout the presentation, if a processor needs any help with finding support for their process, they can reach out to the AAMP staff at any time. That concludes today's presentation on Appendix A and B for cooling and cooking large diameter products, as well as bone and ham production. Please stay tuned for our next video, which is where we will focus on jerky critical limits.